Hi folks, and welcome to the fifth daily critique. So this is the first critique where I'm going to start to introduce some specific learning aspects, and in this case I'm going to discuss white points, particularly in clouds, as well as the use of graduated neutral density filters and some of the issues with using those filters. I'm going to be talking about 5 images by Andrew Whettam, who actually took these photos of Iceland on a trip with me last summer. So it'll be interesting revisiting those, and I hope you enjoy this episode. So these were the 5 images that Andrew sent over, and they were actually all taken on the same day and mid-hike, so he didn't have lots of time to take these. We did need to get to where we were walking. We had about 15 kilometers or so to walk that day off the top of my head. So keep that in mind, but let's get started talking about them in Photoshop. So this image, looking up this floodplain, we had lots of these braided streams to cross, and I guess the focal point here is this rhyolite hill at the background, framed to a certain extent by the hills on the left and right, and then we have this strong foreground element of the cotton grasses, bottom left. I think the problem for me here is that there's a fair amount of what I would call negative space on the right here, so relatively empty compared to the more interesting foreground on the left. You can sort of imagine if these islands of moss spread onto the right hand side there, then it might work a bit more from a balance perspective. Because at the moment it just looks a bit one-sided, unfortunately. Fortunately, Andrew did shoot a slightly stronger version of this same area, this portrait frame. So it's generally true that if you shoot in portrait, it's a bit easier to manage foregrounds, and that's certainly the case here. I think the central placement of the cotton grasses is more effective. You do have the problem with this peak coming in on the right here. I do think that draws the eye a little bit, but overall that's preferable to the previous image, despite some of the little issues where subjects are interfering with the edge of the frame. Now going on to this third shot, much stronger image in my opinion. You've got a better cloudscape at the top of the image, a much stronger focal point in this off-center pyramidal peak here, and then these lovely flowers in the foreground. If I talk about perfect world, I was here. I didn't find a perfect example of these flowers myself, and I think Andrew's done a very good job, but wouldn't it be great if these flowers sort of extended into the distance? So there's a bit of continuity between the foreground and the background, because to me it feels a little bit separate. Also, it would be nice if the flowers didn't come into the bottom edge of the frame here. They start to interfere. I suspect this was just a compromise that Andrew had to make, but again, in an ideal world it might be nice to see them all contained within the frame. But overall, nice colours, a really nice scene, and great to photograph things, not just because they're going to make a great art print for the wall, for example, but also because they capture what the landscape was like when you were there. You can't always shoot your photographs in perfect circumstances, so obviously this is taken in midday sunlight, but it beautifully captures the walk that we had that day. And then we have this edit. So this is one of the ones that Andrew edited himself, and actually he's given me 2 edits. So this one's cropped and obviously has a much more pastely washed out feel to it. I think the ideal probably lies somewhere between the two. I think this one is slightly too contrasty, whilst the washed out one is just slightly too washed out, lacking a bit of clarity there. And I don't mean the literal clarity slider, incidentally. Compositionally, you can see Andrew also cropped out this bottom portion in that edit there, and I can understand that, because to me this is kind of awkward, this placement here. Much nicer to have that diagonal coming in from the bottom left. It's a clearer idea there of this sort of tributary to a larger stream. It's a bit of a 50-50 composition too. I'd certainly lose some of this sky, even as it's cropped here. The crop that Andrew has presented is still a bit too 50-50. It feels a little bit awkward to me. So perhaps I would have tried to look down on the foreground a bit more, so that I could fill the foreground, effectively moving this river into this bottom portion of the frame and sort of tilting the camera down, as it were, just to correct that. You can see here that the reflection is maybe slightly brighter than the sky that it's reflecting, so I'd probably try and keep a bit more brightness in the sky, and it's particularly important to make sure that you have whites in the clouds. I'll just check if Andrew does in this particular case. Almost. So I'd just make sure that you have a true white. In sunlit white clouds, they should be white. Now finally we're on to this image, which is the main learning point photo of this video. Firstly, really strong composition here, obvious S-curve leading line coming up to these mountains in the distance, and there's even the ice cap there in the background. So really nicely composed. Wise to shoot in portrait, because if you shot this in landscape, you'd end up with a lot of grass either side of this this stream here, and I think that would somewhat spoil the composition. So this is really well framed. I guess in an ideal world, you might have these clouds extending off to the right, because of course you have an empty sky on the right and these interesting clouds on the left. But from a critical perspective, I think one mistake has happened here, and that is using a gradient filter, I assume, to hold back the brightness in the sky, with the unfortunate result that the foreground is too bright and the sky is too dark. So I will just have an edit of this in Lightroom, and there's another couple of problems here. You can just about make out a slight brightening here and at the top of the mountain. So if you look at the shadows in the top of the mountain compared to the sort of bit to the left there, and then there's another circular mark at the top of the image. I assume that those are marks either on the filter or on the lens, but of course another problem with using filters is that you have to keep both the lens and the filter clean, so you have to watch out for that. But in this case, I think we would have been better off without a filter at all, and just metering for the highlights in the clouds there. So I'm going to try and edit the filter out completely. So I'm going to brighten this until it looks like it tonally matches this near part of the foreground. So just over a stop here. So maybe Andrew was using a 1-stop filter, I guess. Maybe it was 2-stop soft. I'm not exactly sure. But some filter was used, so that kind of gets rid of that difference. And then I'm just going to reduce the exposure and add a bit of contrast and see what it's looking like. So the sky looks now a bit too bright and washed out, but the crucial thing is that the clouds do have some whites in them. So I will drag a gradient over the top here. I'm just going to introduce a tiny bit of blue just to keep the sky looking nice and fresh. Add a bit of contrast, or a lot of contrast maybe. Sorry, wrong one. There we go, a lot of contrast. And then just trying to keep it nice and bright. Now you can see the left-hand side where the cloud is actually brighter than the right-hand side. So I'm going to really try brightening the right-hand side. Let's reset that and that. And then I'll just darken the left actually. So I don't want to go too far with this, otherwise I just create the opposite problem. So that sort of just rebalances the sky tonally. And then there's various ways that you can correct these flares. I'll just do an example here. So just reset those. So we've lost a bit of contrast, so you could try the dehaze slider, but in this case I'm going to introduce some blacks, and I'm going to slightly warm it, maybe not, keep it neutral. Yeah, I mean, a simple adjustment like that could make that completely disappear, to be honest. And I do each one individually, so same thing. I could go in here and just add a black. Now the sky is going to be harder, so I'd probably make sure I'd finish the sky and then play around editing that in Photoshop, so we can just do that quickly actually. So I will check white points and black points. Now I don't want to turn these videos into editing tutorials, so let's just say I'm setting a white point here just to brighten it up as far as it will go without introducing any clipping. And then I'm just going to add a bit of contrast to the sky by dragging the curve down, so keeping those whites there will effectively add contrast to the sky. So then I'll drag a gradient mask over the top, wrong way around, there we go. And that's probably round about where I'd stop. I might try darkening down this area just locally, the reflection there. A reflection should always be, well, not always actually because of refraction, but should almost always be darker than the sky that it is reflecting. What I should do is invert the mask, not use the paint dropper there, but there you go. A creature of habit. So I'm just going to effectively paint in a local darkening just in that brightest area of water there, just so that it doesn't catch the eye. And then finally, let's just see if we can do anything with this foreground. So we're already clipping greens and the blacks are already starting to clip as well. So we don't want to change either of those points for the foreground, but maybe just drag that curve down. And lastly, let's do another darkening step on the top of the sky there. And then in terms of getting rid of that circular mark there, I will create a new layer and just try the spot healing brush. So just draw that around there. Photoshop usually does a very good job of this, as it has done there, I think. No, it hasn't actually. It's created an edge. So I sometimes do this a few times just until it looks good. There we go. So that's more or less where I'd stop, but really important point here, because we've brightened the sky and added contrast, of course we've introduced noise. Now if this had been shot without the filter, we would not be having this slight noise issue. As it is, it's not an absolute deal breaker, but certainly having good technique when you're out in the field does make a real difference. But yeah, the general tip with this one is to try and recognize if you do choose to use grad filters when they need to be used, and to try and keep those white points in white clouds that are sunlit as white, because otherwise they're going to look a bit strange. So hopefully you found that helpful, and look forward to speaking to you in the next video.